Hi, everyone. My name is Professor Jason Smith of the SCSU History Department, and I'd like to welcome you to another installment of our Summer 2020 Teach-In Lecture Series. In March of 2020, President Donald Trump held a press conference at the White House amid growing concern about the expansion of the COVID-19 virus in the United States. And Trump said in that conference, every generation of Americans has been called to make shared sacrifices for the good of the nation. And now it's our time. We must sacrifice together because we are all in this together and will come through it together. It's the invisible enemy. Now, aside from Trump showing a rare moment of sort of collective unity and purpose in this message, um, he was articulating this fight against COVID-19 as a war. And so, just as I was going at that moment in March of 2020 from an on campus to remote learning at SCSU and teaching a class in War in American Society, in which we were beginning to discuss the ways in which post war America went to war against a number of social ills at home, and really used the power of the state to try and wage a metaphorical war with all the rhetoric, both popular and political, the imagery, the metaphors, uh, and the symbols. All of this seemed so contemporarily relevant, and so we can see just not just Trump's rhetoric and that of others, but all of the imagery, the memes that circulated around social media around this as another kind of war and the virus as another kind of enemy, granted different from enemies of the past and wars of the past, but within very much within that framework. And so you can see this here from this cartoon, just one of many that invoke imagery from World War II of their flag raising on Iwo Jima during World War II, but with a different set of heroes sort of doing the work of the nation. So I was interested in this historical resonance of this idea of a warfare against an invisible enemy and the ways in which the government and American society sort of were employing that metaphor or were sort of responding to it as some sort of way of making sense of this collective experience. Now, so I want to tease out some of what I think those implications are. Some of them I think are troubling, but I always want to do it with the sense that these are only rough and crude analogies. That whenever we're talking about the ways in which the past resonates with the present or might inform the present, we still have to understand, of course, that whether it's World War II or the Cold War or some other time period, that the context was very different. Um, and so we can only be really tentative with some of those analogies and those parallels, understanding, of course, that the past was very different from the various impulses that inform our society today. Nevertheless, I think this is part of a larger framing, as I said, of this newest fight against a new enemy that is in fact quite old and goes back at least to World War II, certainly in the Cold War, if not earlier, and whose modern manifestation really goes back to the 1960s, I think, beginning with the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and particularly his framing of a war against poverty. This sort of metaphor is transformed by various political leaders of all political stripes, into a war on crime, a war on drugs, a war on Christmas. And I think there are sort of two salient features of this post-war use of the war metaphor to frame a fight at home. The first is that it unfolds largely in a Cold War context, in which the United States finds itself both in what is perceived as a perpetual state of warfare, not hot warfare, but a different kind of ideological warfare against the Soviet Union and the communist world, um, and also a state of unwar, that these two are a state of non-war, so that these two, both warfare and not warfare, could sort of exist in tension with one another during the Cold War. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why this rhetoric of warfare tends to pervade American discourse and rhetoric. The second sort of salient feature of this, I think, is that it emerges very much out of the New Deal states willingness and interest to use the power of the government, to use the wealth of American society, and to use a particular political viewpoint of the role of government to cure not only social problems, and not only fight wars overseas, but to really use the power of the state successfully and victoriously against any problem that Americans could face, right? So we see this rhetoric of a war on whatever, or the terminology of an unconditional surrender or a total war, that really comes out of that World War II context, plays out in terms of during the Cold War, and is used in these ways. And of course, I think among conservatives, right, who are very much, in some ways, embracing or in some ways accepting that New Deal state, the role of that state in American political affairs, but also beginning to critique it as well towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century when we talk about a sort of conservative invocation of a war on Christmas, right? I think partly related to this view of government overreach by the liberal state that comes very much out of Roosevelt and the New Deal. And so probably worth pointing out that when we talk about these and think about these wars historically, the war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, uh, the the historical record here is really mixed in terms of the ability of the government to wage successful war on what are perceived to be these social problems. And in fact, it's a record that's not only mixed, but it, in some ways has been disastrous. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some of these salient features that I see resonate between our current experience with the COVID-19 virus and the history here. First of all, framing the battle against the virus, and I'm using the term, I immediately default to that terminology, using this sort of experience with the virus as a fight or a battle or a war, in some ways, invoking that war metaphor brings about a collective sense of unity, of patriotism, of fidelity to the state, of common purpose. And I think that that's not coincidental, particularly in a time when American politics and American culture and society are at a really divisive point. Wars can be used, they can be manufactured, and in fact, they can quite naturally create a sense of unity and common purpose, particularly as this is a fight, right, in which everyone nationally, perhaps globally, is implicated, right, in which we're all struggling. And so there could be a sense of common purpose, common action, common behavior, and certainly common experience in some cases, that can be really powerful. And so, we see this in various social media memes, like the one that circulated in March and April of 2020, talking about and invoking the greatest generation of World War II and how, they fought wars against fascism and totalitarianism and had triumphed over the Great Depression. And all we have to do is sit on our couches indoors and watch Netflix and quarantine ourselves, and that we can do this, right? So there is that invocation of war again. There is that invocation of a common purpose and a common unity, a call to action, um, that we see now and historically. Um, it also warfare in this way also creates, as I mentioned earlier, a new kind of hero, right, or a new set of heroes. That war creates heroism, it creates villainy and evil as well, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But it creates heroism, and so we see the uplifting of different types of heroes: medical heroes, first responder heroes, grocery store workers, people who deliver your mail, that these people, many of whom have been marginalized, and people who collect your trash, have been marginalized and really invisible to us, are all of a sudden amplified, which can be really good, of course. But it also raises the question of then how will they be valued by society going forward? Will they continue to be valued? And will that value actually manifest itself in tangible ways by paying them more, by providing them more benefits? And by uplifting them more generally in society. And I think what we've seen as the virus and the quarantine has evolved into the summer of 2020, is that some of those feelings of unity, certainly, and some of those feelings of a collective sense of who our set of heroes is, have begun to fade already. Right? And so I think there are interesting historical implications here that if we look at traditional wars and the sorts of military heroes that come out of those wars, right, we often uplift them, thank them for their service and their sacrifice, but how do they actually get treated? Medically, emotionally, do they find jobs? And when we look at the American past, that record is decidedly mixed, if not worse. That Americans, historically, going all the way back to the Revolution, have not taken good care of their veterans after the war has been won or lost. And so I think there are interesting and perhaps troubling implications for the kinds of heroes that we create today and whether that actually translates into meaningful change for those people's conditions and the things that they struggle with. Warfare also uh, tends to obviously um, result in death. That is one sort of fundamental experience of warfare, and death on a scale that seems unnatural, right? Particularly um, people in their, in the prime of their lives, in their youths, who are taken instantaneously, in which, the body, there's nothing left, no trace in modern warfare of a body that's been obliterated by an IED or something like that. And so there, I think, are interesting parallels here to the COVID-19 case, and I'm particularly thinking of some really prominent work that's been done in the era of the Civil War by a historian named Drew Gilpin Faust, who talked about a sort of new culture of death around the Civil War, which was a war that brought about mass death and a confrontation of death. That had not been seen before in American history. And so the culture needed to respond to that in various ways. It tried to grapple onto and hold fast to some ways of consoling people, families and individuals privately, trying to hold on to some of those old ideals of what death should be. There should be a body. There should be a good death where the person who was dying faced their fate nobly and with courage, right? Warfare seemed to undermine a lot of those principles of what death should be as a culture or cultural experience in American life during the Civil War. And so I think we see this again playing out in the modern context with COVID-19, changing all sorts of ideas about how we perceive death, how we encounter death, particularly of relatives who we can't visit in hospitals or in nursing homes, how we communicate with them through windows or through masks, how we can't hold funerals, in which the sort of collective grieving that is so necessary for closure, perhaps, is just unable to happen. And so I think that what history teaches us in terms of large numbers of deaths is that American culture and American society tries to hold on to old rituals because they're affirming and they're comfortable and they're consoling. And in this new war, we've got to try to figure out ways to hold on to those rituals even as things are forced to change. And so there, I think, is another salient feature. And I don't think it's also a coincidence that when we think about the death toll of COVID-19, for a while, and I guess it was April or May, when we were somewhere around 60,000 deaths in the United States, that very much in the political rhetoric and in the media rhetoric was this comparison to the Vietnam War, that the United States victims of COVID-19 has now surpassed the death toll from Vietnam. Those sort of benchmark measures and baselines, I think, and the reference to war as a way to wrap our mind around death and what that actually means is not coincidental. Another implication, I think, of declaring war on the virus is an expansion of government power, and particularly the threat of an expansion of executive power. And we see in Donald Trump quite blatantly the willingness to expand the power of the presidency whenever he possibly can. And so I think the COVID-19 virus and the pandemic, at least in its early manifestation, represented an opportunity for the expansion of presidential power. Trump, as I said at the first quote at the beginning of this lecture, really began to frame himself as a wartime president, fighting an invisible enemy. And what we know from conventional wars or even more unconventional wars against social ills is that when framing a fight against a common enemy, in a state of emergency, that gives the president, as the leader of the government, the leader of the executive branch, the commander in chief of the military, tremendous power, and that other branches of government should sort of, in wartime, cede power to the presidency in the interest of winning whatever fight there is in the context of whatever national emergency there is. So I think there's some danger here. Although very quickly, I think President Trump realized that this was an invisible enemy unlike the United States has ever fought before, even if it had, not that he necessarily realized it, but even if it had a sort of shadows of those earlier wars against American social ills. This was a different kind of war and one that could not be easily won. And so Trump always, I think, wore that mantle of wartime president uneasily, even if he wanted to embrace it. And I think when he realized that he couldn't win it, he seemed to very quickly shift away from that rhetoric of "I am a wartime president. I'm not holding these press conferences regularly anymore. I don't want to be seen as the leader of a national effort. I want to actually diffuse power and authority to governors to deal with this stuff." So it's really interesting the ways in which Trump, in the role of the executive, has first tried to use it and then tried to dismiss it for perhaps his own political purposes. But we certainly see, right, from Lincoln to Wilson to Roosevelt, wartime presidents taking on expanded powers and the ways in which that might be a threat. Particularly in the realm of civil and personal liberties, right? That wartime is a time in which the government takes on tremendous power, often at the expense of the rights and liberties of its citizens. And so, not surprisingly, as that unity, that initial unity, begins to be broken down in the spring and summer of 2020, and the virus, like so much else, is politicized in the United States, we see all sorts of questions about liberties being infringed upon, whether that's on one side, right, the question of mask wearing and can I be made to wear a mask, or enduring travel restrictions to certain places, or whether it's okay to have cell phone companies and big tech companies monitor my movement across the country just to see how much movement across space helps to spread the virus. So wartime is a time of threats to civil and personal liberties, whether we're talking about the arrest of socialists during World War I under the Sedition Act of 1918, or the same sorts of activities in World War II under the Smith Act in 1940, or the Patriot Act after 9/11, these sorts of questions of rights and liberties being infringed upon, not just by a powerful executive, but by a powerful government that needs to curtail certain rights and liberties in time of warfare. We see that, I think, unfolding today. And what we know historically is that that's had dangerous implications. The legal system, the court system has tended to uphold some of these restrictions on liberty during wartime. Whether that will happen now or not, we don't know. Whether that will be an implication now or not in its most dangerous form, we don't know, but it's a possibility. Another salient feature of the fight against COVID-19 is the mobilization of American society against the virus. And so there are a number of parallels to wartime. Again, not just in the imagery, Rosie the respirator maker, right? But also rationing of certain foods and resources, We see artists in the era of COVID-19 using World War II era propaganda themes and admitting as much that they were influenced by the sorts of imagery to come out of World War II propaganda in order to convince people to stay inside or to wear face masks, etc. Um, so we see the ability of the state in wartime, whatever the nature of the war, to mobilize in ways to meet the emergency. And politically and economically, that's taken the form of the Defense Manufacturing Act, um, in which the president has the power to essentially, make governments or make businesses convert to producing things that are in need to fight this war. In this case, face masks and ventilators. So the use of the state to coordinate and to mobilize this effort of the American economy and to sort of bring everybody together in pursuit of these goals is I think a salient feature of this war, as in other wars. But we also see a danger here, right? That if we look particularly at the relationships between the public and the private sector historically during wartime and the ways in which contracts are divvied up, and tremendous amounts of money are expended. It's ripe for corruption and nepotism, right? This was true of the Nye Commission after World War I, that saw this sort of insidious relationship between government and private industry, and lots of corruption and lots of overspending. And one wonders what the implication will be for today, in which millions of dollars are being thrown at pharmaceutical companies, and certainly people in the administration, in the executive branch, and the cabinet have all sorts of investments in some of these big pharma companies. And so one wonders how this tremendous mobilization of American society and expenditure of money will work, not just in fighting the invisible enemy, but how that will actually play out in terms of the fair allotment of tremendous amounts of money. Another troubling feature of this war on a virus is creating an enemy. The virus itself is an invisible enemy. One of the reasons I think why Trump has moved away from the mantle of wartime president is because, as many people have commented, it's not easy for him to frame the virus as a political enemy in the way that he's so good at framing political enemies otherwise. And so he's really struggled to embody this virus as a sort of enemy that needs to be killed or overcome, as much as that rhetoric was really pervasive in the early to mid spring. I think in the aftermath of that, in being unable to personify or embody a particular kind of enemy in this fight, the shift has been to sort of racialize this, as it was in 1918, right, with the Spanish influenza. We see the Trump administration using the term Chinese virus, or even more problematically, Kung flu, as a way to really place blame and responsibility on an external threat, one that already has a whole lot of resonance in American politics and foreign policy, right? That is sort of blaming China, and the ways in which that resonates, particularly with racist ideas of Asians and Chinese in particular. Think about the notion of the yellow peril, in which Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants were caricatured very much as a kind of virus that was invading the shores of the United States. So I think whether that's intentional or not, that's very much in our sort of historical understanding of this, our historical consciousness, I should say, and it has implications, right? That there is a rise in discrimination against Asian Americans. That somebody's got to be responsible for this, and it's often people who are othered, are racialized others, or economically marginalized others, class-based others, ethnic others, that become the victims and indeed the perceived perpetrators of these sorts of things. And we also see, talking about sort of a foreign invasion of American borders that very much resonates with Trump's rhetoric. I think we see the ways in which this sort of plays out more silently than the Kung Flu, more silently in the ICE detention centers throughout the United States, in which COVID cases are and have expanded tremendously without all that much attention or concern on the part of the government to make these places safe. Another analogy I think is to the American prison system. And just the ways in which, in those sorts of places, in those sorts of spaces, in those sorts of institutions, among people who are marginalized and have very few rights already, they can be victimized perhaps more than others. So I want to wrap up the lecture by talking about how this, I think, converges with the Black Lives Matter protests that are very much a part of this historical moment, and I think that are very much, of course, related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the quarantine, right? Many people have noted the connections between the two and the ways in which the virus impacts in unequal ways communities of color, access to medical care, and all sorts of other ways in which these two things are unfolding at the same time. People who are out of work, who are frustrated by the general response to the virus and other issues, find themselves in the streets protesting, not just for Black lives, although that primarily, but also I think a general sense of disillusionment at the state of the country. And so I think that what we're seeing now is a real shift um, by the president in particular in his rhetoric away from a wartime president against an invisible enemy that he can't seem to beat towards a different kind of enemy that's more embodied, that has particular resonance among his base in particular. And that is to return to that idea of war on crime, a war on protest, a war against America, right? Of burning flags and people who will take over the courthouse and people who have no respect for America. And Trump very much framing himself away from a wartime president against the virus to a law and order president. Which also, of course, has a lot of military and militaristic and militarized resonance, right? Going back to that war on crime, war on poverty, war on cities of the 1960s, 70s, and onward. And so this is how I see things sort of pivoting here in ways that are dangerous for all of the reasons that I've spoken about in relationship to the virus. But we certainly see that sort of interest in militarizing this issue, and when the American military, through the defense secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, refusing to participate in the sort of law and order that Trump wants in American cities. Right now, we've seen a transformation to the use of executive police forces in that sort of paramilitary way, right? And so, this is part of a larger story that has seen surplus military equipment going back to Vietnam enter into American cities and be used during the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. The excess equipment from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Humvees, and all sorts of incredibly powerful military vehicles being essentially given to local police departments around the country, such as the Humvee there that got a lot of attention that ended up in the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. Wondering sort of how American law enforcement has been militarized in ways that give tremendous power to the police at the expense often of the rights of American citizens. And so we see this playing out in a lot of really troubling ways that I think have a relationship to the COVID-19 virus, and the ways in which it was framed as a war. So I've tried to lay out some of the parallels I see historically with the present moment, the ways in which this idea of war as a metaphor uh, brings up questions of power, of money, and those questions are also can be very troubling. And so I'll just sort of leave us with this a quote from Mary Dudziak, who is a prominent historian of American war and society. Wrote a really fascinating book about this concept of wartime and how it gives the government tremendous power, and how wartime is actually much more ambiguous than we might think about a declaration of war or an ending of war. That if we actually look at American history, we see the United States involved in one kind of war or another, official, unofficial, conventional, unconventional, traditional or not, uh, throughout most of American history, and what the implications are for the country. Um, Dudziak says wartime is a claim or justification drawn upon for expanding government power. When we understand that wartime is an argument, it's not exactly, it's a creation, it's a construction, it's an argument being made that we were at war against something, rather than an inevitable feature of our world, then we can see that it need not cause us to suspend our principles. Our times do not determine our actions, they do not absolve us from judgment. And so I would just encourage all of us to be suspicious about the ways in which war and this rhetoric and this imagery is used. Beware of grabs at power and authority and wealth. And that this is a time, really, if we understand our history, to look out for those who might easily become victims of this sort of authority. Thank you very much for listening.